Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my Gaudium et Spes 22.com Podbean podcasts and YouTube videos. I'm a little bit, I had to switch off my usual microphone, my fancy pants, expensive Shure digital microphone, because I was told by my guest today that I was coming across as a little crackly. So I am using I have a new iMac. I'm using its speaker feature. So hopefully, if the sound quality seems a little different, that is why. At any rate, here we go. I also am still woke up this morning with all kinds of allergies and graveliness in my voice. Those who are constant viewers of my show, I'm plagued with this, but this too shall pass someday. Anyway, I am joined today, very excited, by a guest. Gosh, I think Satan did not want this guest to show up on the show today because good things must be going to happen because I had to cancel two, three times. There was a power outage, which actually happens a lot on the farm here, and then I was sick and a few other things, so I can't even remember everything. But anyway, the guest today was someone that was recommended to me by my good friend Mike Aquilina. Now, those of you who know Mike Aquilina know he's just about the most brilliant human being on the planet, even though he would deny that. And I just love Mike. He's great. So I thought, well, when Mike recommended my guest today, I said, who am I to disagree with the great Mike Aquilina? I'm interviewing someone today I've never met before, never spoken with before. So I'm going to be learning as much about our guest today as you are. And that guest is, without further ado, Mr. Michel Therrien. Michael, welcome to the show today.
Well, thanks, Larry. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, so before we're going to be talking, you have a new book out, and we're going to be talking about your book. What is the title of your book? So I don't want to get it wrong, so everybody can know what the title of your book is.
Yeah, so the title is Wounded Witness, Reclaiming the Church's Unity in a Time of Crisis.
And usually I have read the books of my guests, but I have to admit that I have not had the opportunity to read your book. So, like I said before, I'm going to be learning as much today as my guests, my listeners are about your book. I know a little bit about the book from your description of it. But before we get into the book, why don't you introduce yourself to my listeners and viewers? Who is Michel Therrien? Where does he live? What makes him tick? What gets him up in the morning?
Yeah, well, good. Well, okay, so I live in Pittsburgh and actually am good friends with Mike Aquilina too. That's obviously how we made the connection. Mike and I go way back, a lot of years to my time at St. Vincent Seminary. So I actually grew up in the Seattle area. And I moved out this way to go to Franciscan University back in the mid 90s to get a master's in theology, and then
Yeah.
went away to do doctoral studies overseas, and then came back to the Pittsburgh area to teach at St. Vincent Seminary in 2005, which is around the time I met Mike. And I'm a moral theologian by training, but as divine providence would have it, along my very circuitous journey as a theologian, have ended up really spending probably the last 10 years of my life very much focused on the pastoral life of the church, uh, focused on discipleship, the new evangelization. How do we create a transformative reality in our parishes? So back in 2014, I came back to the Diocese of Pittsburgh to work as a secretary for evangelization. And then during that time, I started an institute called the Institute for Pastoral Leadership, and we were doing a lot of um, formation for our lay ecclesial ministers and working with our clergy to try to create a culture of a more robust culture of discipleship in the parish. And I give you that background because it really is the backdrop for this book. Because as I really got into the trenches of working in parish life, I had a lot of assumptions going into the trenches, you could say, and I
I
found
bet.
that
Don't we all,
yes,
Michael, when we
and
when we
I found
start
that a
that
lot
kind
of
of
my
thing?
assumptions were not quite right, and that a lot of the things that I learned along the way about what needed to change in parish life were things I had to go through a process of unlearning and then relearning things on a very practical level about what happens in the parish. And one of the things that I really began to see is just how divided our people are around what I what I call in the book different theological tribes or different camps, as you will. And way back, even in 2010, 2011, 12, that time period, there was a lot of things happening in the church around the new evangelization. There was the synod on the word, there was the synod on the new evangelization, the synod on St. Paul, and Sherry Woodell came out with her book on forming intentional disciples. And a
Yeah.
little further on after that, you had Father Mallon came out with Divine Renovation. So it was in the context of this period that I was noticing that people were operating out of different paradigms of Christian discipleship. So, long story, maybe too long already, but in around 2017, I had a number of priests here in the diocese who said, "You really need to write a book on this." So, I got to work, and the book finally, it actually came out last year. It's just
Yeah.
a little over a year ago. So, anyhow, that's a little bit about me and my professional background.
Well, that sounds fascinating, actually, and I mean, it's kind of, in a little nutshell, it's kind of a testimony to Vatican II in a lot of ways. One of the things that I think that we just take for granted in this day and age is the massive number of lay people that are involved in ministry, in parish
Yes.
ministry, and to those of a much older generation, even older than I am, believe it or not, who grew up before the Second Vatican Council, they can remember a time when the kinds of things you're doing, Michael, were done almost exclusively by priests and nuns. And that
Yes.
it was just almost unheard of that you'd have like a lay man or woman who was the DRE of a parish, or the head of pastoral ministry in a particular parish, or the head of liturgy in a parish, or the head of pastoral counseling in a parish. It just didn't happen. And now, and yet here you are. You're not only actively involved in these kinds of ministries. You've written a book about it, and I just think I always like to point this out, especially to my more traditionalist leaning viewers who are sometimes very critical of Vatican II. Uh, that I do notice that like the traditionalist movement is very much a lay person centered movement, and yet it's kind of a testimony to Vatican II that you've got all of these lay
Yeah.
people involved and so on. So anyway, I just throw that out there. But let's move on then to, you said that because it immediately struck me that you had a lot of surprises that when you first entered into ministry, and boy, that is so true. I remember I've never actually, except when I was a seminarian, been involved in directly in parish ministry. I was more a teacher in a classroom, and yet same thing. The very first day I taught at a prep school in Princeton, New Jersey for 4 years while working on my dissertation, and then off to college, university. I had to be disabused of so many crazy, stupid ideas about modern students and teaching, and you found out the same. So what was the main sort of shock when you first started into doing evangelization, doing ministry? What are some of the things you had to sort of unlearn and then learn?
Yeah, well, gosh, there's quite a few of them, and they're all kind of important, but let me just tick off a few of them. I think I went into, when I came back to the diocese, so I sort of, I didn't leave academia, but because I've been teaching all along, I continue to teach at St. Vincent's, and I've taught at Franciscan and different things. But I got into this secretariat head position where I'm really literally responsible for the mission and identity of, 60 some Catholic schools and at the time 188 parishes. And then the Diocese of Pittsburgh, as you might know, has gone through this massive consolidation, and
Yeah,
we're down to like 62 parishes from 188, which has its own set of problems. But I went in thinking that the only thing that really needed to be resolved was kind of the left-right, theological tension in the church, which
yeah,
certainly is an issue. But what one of the main things, let's just talking about Vatican II is, I'm a real student of the council. I've studied all the documents very, very
yeah,
closely. I've taught them, and I love them because there's a beauty and richness in them. But one of the things I realized, and I do address it in the book, is that there was actually no plan for implementation for the council. There was just kind of this assumption that everything would fall into its proper place. Well, the reality is that no organization can carry out its mission without a good plan. And planning is a kind of cascading reality because it has to come down all the way down through the ranks. And so there were a lot of assumptions made in the late 60s and 70s that what we had brought historically into the council as all of the strongholds of the Catholic faith and our strength would just kind of remain. And everything became very confused. And the everybody were chasing their tails. And I remember when I was teaching at St. Vincent's, and an older faculty member who was dean of the seminary the year I was born in 1969 said, when the council came, we were told we were not allowed to use the manuals anymore of theology to teach in the seminary, but we had no textbooks. We didn't actually know
Yeah.
what we were supposed to use as resources. So we just grabbed whatever we could find and started using them. Well, that's just like one example. So, in the years after the council, we know that there was a lot of confusion, and a lot of people want to ascribe that to a kind of ideological battle where certainly that's part of the story. But there was also just there was a lot of practical administrative confusion in how to implement the vision of the council on a kind of strategic level. And so, when John Paul II came into his pontificate, he had a lot of things to clarify for the church, first of all, in terms of what did the council actually mean by this, that, and we needed some guiding documents, which we got a lot of. Um, when Pope Benedict came in, we were still dealing with some of those issues. We also had a lot of liturgical questions because we know how liturgy unfolded in the 70s and 80s. But I think that what I found happen is a lot of distrust, and a lot of people were being polarized into subcultures within the church and digging in and developing what I feel are very strong blind spots towards other members of the church. And my personal experience has been that I've kind of moved around and I've been situated in a lot of different ecclesiastical settings. And I've learned a lot from people in different subcultures in the church and grown a lot and been formed by them, but I don't see a lot of bad will or maliciousness. I don't see people don't get up every day and decide that they're going to destroy or ruin the church. They have a particular lens or hermeneutic. And
Yeah.
so the book is an attempt to try to bring people together and get us talking about what we both hold in common, but also our profound differences in how we see things.
Wow, gosh, there's so much packed into what you just said. That is, I think, extremely worthy of. I mean, just one or two things you said we could talk for an hour and a half on. Let me start with, he said in 1969. Who was it that he was like a teacher at a seminary in
Yeah, well, he
69,
was a senior member of our faculty at St. Vincent Seminary,
and he had
and
started there in 69.
no, he was dean in 69.
Oh, he
So
was
he
dean in
so he
69.
so he did
Okay,
seminary prior to the council,
right.
and a good man, but
So here,
yeah.
what immediately leaps to my mind is this. Yes, he's absolutely right. One of the problems is that the council sweeps away the manuals that were being used in the seminaries as the primary textbooks for training seminarians. And that when that happened, this priest says, I didn't know what else to replace them with. That right there tells me that his own formation in the pre-conciliar church was lacking, his own intellectual formation, because there was actually good theology out there that had been published and, for the most part, translated into English that one could avail themselves of. But the fact is, a lot of priests didn't. A lot of priests just assumed what I learned in seminary via the manuals is all I really need to know. And so when those manuals went away, there really was. So then all of a sudden, what is then in front of them? Well, what's in front of them is all the crazy stuff that was being generated by various nouveau Catholic presses and theologians and so forth. And you're right. I mean, one could hardly fault them for saying, well, this has an imprimatur on it, and and
Must be okay. Yeah.
written by a guy with a PhD from Boston College, trained by the Jesuits. It must be okay. And so they started teaching this stuff in the seminaries, and a whole generation of priests start teaching this stuff in the seminary. So that's kind of like my first observation, which is that the issues really were complex. That the formation just so I agree with you. It's not like a whole generation of priests and nuns and other people, bishops, woke up one day and said, let's see how we can destroy everything that came before.
Yes. Yes. And I think that that narrative is that getting that right is important. And you touch on something super important, which is the formation prior to the council. We can have this assumption that everything was kind of golden in the life of the church before the council and forget why we needed it. And I think one of the deficiencies, and this same professor once said to me, oh, as well as like, we never got to read Aquinas. We read,
Right.
commentaries and manuals. We never got to read the primary sources. And in fact, he talked about when he was in seminary, training in Rome at the time. This would have been in the 50s. The professors would teach the manuals, and it was all in Latin. It was just memorization, And then he said, and then they would put that away, and they say, oh well, we're not supposed to do this, but now let's read the really good stuff. And what they were actually reading at that time were all the great, theologians that preceded the council that were actually doing, the heavy theological lifting that fed into the council documents. And, I mean, Pope Benedict would have been sort of one of the younger ones coming
Yeah.
up at the very end of that era and that generation.
Yeah.
And you can hardly fault that generation for the work that they did. But the other thing that I think is important to note is they're called by some the heroic generation of theologians. That
Rusty
generation,
Rusty Reno, yeah.
yes, yes, that's a great article. But
Yeah.
that he wrote on that. But that
Hmm.
prior to the council, in dismantling the neo-scholastic framework, they actually didn't appreciate the foundation that gave them the ability to be such creative and such uh, vibrant theologians in that generation. And so the generation that came up after them that didn't actually have that training were not able to implement
Right.
the depth and the nuance
That's right.
of that generation of theologians. And so by the time you get into the 70s and 80s, you have what Pope Benedict called at the time he was Joseph Ratzinger, a lot of hack theology where, it just wasn't
Yeah.
it wasn't great stuff, and it
Yeah.
wasn't the same guiding light that we had in the 30s, 20s, 30s, 40s, and
No,
50s.
it's so true, and but I want to really double down and highlight what you just said about the fact that all was not rosy in the pre-conciliar church. Already, you mentioned Joseph Ratzinger, right? Already in 1958, a young Father Ratzinger writes this bombshell article that gets published in a German journal called Hochschild, I think it's called. And the title of the article was "The New Paganism or the New Heathenism Spin on the
Yes.
in the Church." And some of the quotes that you can, and I became alerted to this article by Ratzinger by reading Peter Seewald's biography, two-volume biography of Pope Benedict. And you get to that section in Seewald's biography where he's quoting this stuff. And it's like, wow, this is amazing. Because here's a young Father Ratzinger saying the church is riddled with unbelief. It's riddled with pagan rot in the church from top to bottom. And you're thinking, no, wait a minute. Isn't this the idyllic, wonderful pre-Vatican II church that so many of the traditionalists liked? Please don't email me, traditionalists. I understand that's a bit of a caricature, right? But hey, it's out there. I see it. I'm not blind. It's on social media where many traditionalists will say, if we can just get back before to being what was taught before the council and the liturgy before the council, all was not rosy before the council. There's a reason why the complete bottom fell out of the church when there was no real program, as you put it, instituted after the council for legitimate reform. It was willy-nilly, every man for himself, and then the whole bottom just fell out.
Yeah, and I think that, to just echo the point you're making, that age which is often touted as the golden age of Catholicism, Bishop Barron calls the age of decadent Christianity when, we had on the one hand, the advantage of all of the institutional influence that we had, but the bottom didn't come out of the church simply in the 1960s. Like the whole bottom fell out of Western civilization 200 years
Yeah.
earlier when the prevailing faith of the continent was Christian. Even going back to the Reformation, we forget that the people, the 9 million or so, folks that left the Catholic Church during the age of the Reformation were Catholics. And so part of what I address in the book is that we shouldn't have too much of a nostalgia for that age of the church because perhaps we abandon a lot of the foundational principles of the gospel, and the formation of the people of God was not where it should have been, because had it been where it should have been, we wouldn't have seen, kind of this gradual decline of, Christendom and
Yes.
this
Yes.
civilization. So that's a hard indictment, and I do talk about this in my book, not because I want to beat up on the past, but we have to have a realistic appraisal of where we've come so that we know where we need to go forward. And there's a reclamation project that needs to get underway with going back to some of the missional, the principles of a missionary church that go back into the ancient world, where the life of the people of God is lived in a much more profoundly radical way. And that radical way of living is not necessarily that of the Baroque period of the church.
Wow. I knew when Mike Aquilina recommended an interview that I was going to like you, and I do. That's right up my alley. I couldn't agree more. Uh, what I often like to say is the causes of the malaise that we see in the church today, which are related to the causes to the malaise in our culture. Those causes are multifocal and complex, as history usually is. It's
Yes.
complex. I'm reminded when you were speaking of the great book by the scholar Brett Gregory called The Unintended Reformation. And his point in there is, and it's been a long time since I read the book, but I'm pretty sure I'm getting this right. His point in there is that the church theologically and sacramentally, and in terms of its structure, had everything that it really needed to be successful. And in many ways, it was being successful. It was, in many ways, a very vibrant church. What brought it low? What brought it down? What caused its dissolution? Well, in Gregory's thesis, it's the church lacked charity. It had all kinds of proper ideas, but it lacked charity. It
Mhm.
lacked a capacious magnanimity towards those with whom it perhaps needed to dialogue. It wanted power unto it. So it was, the typical thing, power, corruption, bishops acting like petty autocratic Renaissance princes, and then, of course, just a profound lack of charitable concern on a lot of different levels. And so one could say, well, it was just Luther's rebellion. But as you correctly point out, I mean, there had been other heretics. Why? I often say Luther was like a little boy playing with matches in a fireworks factory. The fireworks were there,
Right.
the combustibles were there, right?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I mean, there's a lot, there's so many different contributing factors to how the church developed in the modern period. Um, we don't need to go into all of those, but it is a complex history, and your point's well taken. Now, on a positive note, I would say the beauty of coming through adolescence um, in the life of the church is that you do wisen up. And I often say that, to your point, that charity is really the last man standing in the postmodern context. And it was always only the only man that was ever standing to give witness. Like Christian charity lived fully is the greatest and most powerful witness of the truth of the gospel, because charity is the truth that we proclaim. And the God who loves us, the God who pours himself out in this very, kenotic way, self-emptying way. I mean, this is the Christian gospel. And I think that one of the things I do address in the book is that what was lacking in the modern church is proper formation. And the modern period is a very rationalistic age. And I think that as a church, from the pastoral life of the church, we can see that so much of our formative efforts went into a post-reformational intellectual formation where we're trying to counter the theological points of the Reformation period. And not that we shouldn't have done that or didn't need to do that, but we know, I think more recently, that there are these three other areas of formation which are so critical to the life of a disciple. And that's our human formation, the formation of the human heart. There's the spiritual formation, which is our relationship with the Lord. And then there's our apostolic formation, which is our ability to go out into the world and our capacity to share the gospel with others and to contribute to the building of the kingdom of God. Well, we've done a lot of good intellectual formation. I mean, if you look at the span of the last 500 years, we've done a lot of great, incredible work there. But more recently, maybe the intellectual formation since the council hasn't been where it needed to be. But without the other three areas of formation, we simply can't be a missionary church that grows. So, my life's work as it with my organization Preambula Group is really focused on those three areas. And what I write about in the book very much has to do with the fact that we need a complete and integral formation for the people of God, and that's the second big thing that I learned going into the trenches was a lack of proper formation for the laity. You can't expect the laity to go out and sanctify the world without having a formational pathway that allows them to mature as followers of Jesus.
And do you lay out in your book ideas for what that formational pathway might look like?
Well, I indicate the direction we need to go
Right.
in the last two chapters, and part of that is that we have to recognize what's gotten us to the place that we are at. But I lay out, how did Jesus make disciples, and I sketch,
Oh, that's a
the
great way to that man, that is a fantastic way to approach it. How did Jesus make disciples? I'm sorry to interrupt, but man,
no
that
no
just
no
really
that's
struck.
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, but that's the last chapter. I do want to do a follow-up book called The Way of Christian Discipleship, which would really unpack that. But in that final chapter, one of the things going back to like I look at these different paradigms, and one of the things I argue is that each of the theological camps or tribes, they have a core value that's essential to the life of a disciple. So we can't choose among them. We have to choose all of them. But the important thing is that we have to integrate those values into our life as a disciple of Jesus. So what I do in the latter part of the book is help people understand, well, how does Jesus integrate those five core values from the five, paradigms that I lay out? And
Yeah,
then how does he evangelize and make disciples by deploying those five values in the life of his ministry? So what it provides is a kind of roadmap, you could say, for how to go forward.
fantastic. Oh man. No, I definitely have to get your book. And by the way, when I post this up on YouTube, I will put in the program notes at where people can go to buy your book. I'm assuming your book is still in print. I hope it is because I want to
Oh
order
yeah,
it.
no, I'm selling
Yep.
it through Amazon. Divine Renovation, Father James Mallon's organization, published the book, but we're publishing it through like we're dispensing it through Amazon. So
Yeah, I'd like
just
to
go to
get it into the
Amazon,
hands
purchase
of a
it.
lot of people because there are a lot of lay people and in priests involved in, not just in ministry, but in the creation of lay disciples. I think this is such a, gosh, you are really barking up the tree that I like to bark up too, which is the post-Vatican II universal call to holiness. The fact that lay people too are called to participate in the life of holiness, obviously in conjunction with a congruence with your state in life. And for most lay people, that state in life is to be married and have children. And if you're not married and have children, at least working in the world of some kind. And so, and you have various other irons in the fire if you're not married and have kids. But the point is, you're not a priest, you're not a nun. You're out there in the world, and that's going to color, your state in life is going to color your call to holiness and what it's going to look like. But I don't think you can divide discipleship from that pursuit of holiness, right?
No, I mean, that's what discipleship is.
Yes.
Um, and it's, I often say, we have to lead people into the heart of Jesus before they'll go out into the world and bring Christ to other people. So that interior formation of the laity is critical to the realization of the universal call to holiness and the role of the laity to sanctify the world. And that formation cannot simply be intellectual. Like the biggest barrier to moving forward with the new evangelization is the lack of proper formation in the human heart. And people are so broken and so wounded and suffering so much in the world today. The postmodern world has been a wrecking ball. So there's a lot of work of binding up wounds and helping people be restored in their baptismal life in Christ, on a very human level, teaching people how to pray and how to really have intimacy with God so that they have the courage and the aptitude, you could say, to go out into the world and share the Lord with other people, and then also be aware of the gifts that they have so that we all know what part do we play in the body of Christ, to use Paul's ecclesiology. What member of the body am I? How
Yeah.
do I build up not only the life of my parish, but as an ambassador of my parish, how am I building up the community around me with the theological gifts that God has given to me? So there's a lot of work to be done for sure.
And that trying to figure out where you are in the body of Christ involves not just vocational discernment, it also, I think, involves an examination of conscience and a commitment to a certain ascetical path in life where you allow your conscience to prune away your sinful defects that get in the way of your vocational discernment. It's all well and good to say, well, this is my vocation, but I think it's also important that we train people, we train lay people to truly have a sensitive conscience, not a scrupulous conscience, but a sensitive conscience, so as to be more self-critical in order to live more abundantly this vocational call that we're being given.
Yes, and that process is really driven by the spiritual life and having knowing the pathway to integration, the proper integration of my personhood, my personality in Christ, so that I really am functioning in my life as a member of Christ's body. And that's not just something that we share in common with all members of the church, but we uniquely participate in that calling. So our calling, our vocation is also very personal in the sense that no, God didn't make anybody quite like me. And the
That's
biggest
right.
challenge that I face every day as a person is, can I get up and recognize that being, to quote Matthew Kelly here, the best version of myself, integrated, holy, virtuous, all of those things. That's my mission to the world, because I can contribute to the building up of the world in ways uniquely that only I can do, and we can all say that. Um, and I think that a lot of people in the ministry that I do in the Diocese of Pittsburgh, probably the number one thing that people are blind to is what their own gifts, their own capacity, their own ability that the Holy Spirit has placed within them. And they live in a lot of self-loathing, self-contempt, a lot of shame. And uh, we try to help, kind of in a sense, liberate people from that and
Yeah.
discover their gifts. And then all of a sudden they are out, out there doing stuff,
Yeah.
making stuff happen. So
Is it your experience, Michael? It's certainly mine, that in most average people living in, like, some Catholic living on a cul-de-sac in the suburbs or whatever, there is actually a deep thirst for doing something heroic. There is a deep thirst to do something bigger than my life. And I remember when I was, and that if we just, they're just waiting for the opportunity for the church to challenge them to do this. Kind of analogously, I remember when I was a kid, I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I remember, I lived in a typical sort of just suburban neighborhood, and people didn't really know each other all that well. And then a tornado one summer came through my neighborhood, and there was a lot of destruction, and there were
mm,
people that were injured. And I remember that all of a sudden, out of the houses came people that you would never really even wave at when you drove by. And suddenly we were all cooperating with one another. Suddenly we were helping each other rescue this person, help that person, find this lost dog, this lost cat, and so on. And it created bonds of friendship in my neighborhood that remained from that point forward. And it's something that has always stuck with me, which is everybody in my neighborhood were living these quiet, isolated little individual lives. And yet when the moment, as Hans Urs von Balthus said, an Ernstfall moment, a crisis moment, a decisional moment came upon them, they rose to a level of cooperative heroism that they maybe didn't even know was inside of them. And that's what I think the church needs to tap into more.
Yes, you're right. There's a kind of a technical phrase that I oftentimes use, and I borrow it from a theological friend of mine. He's actually a Protestant. His name is Alan Hirsch, but he talks about the tension between liminality and communitas, which is
Yes.
like when we are thrown off our, back on our heels, or we're thrown into a crisis. It's at those moments when we come together and form deeper community and fellowship and connection with each other. The problem is the church can become very complacent in her habitual and institutionalized ways of operating and functioning. And so we should expect that the Lord is going to disrupt the apple cart, if you will, and he's going to call us, out into the streets to help each other and to come together. But it would be nice if maybe the church would call herself to that accountability. That, the average parish or family would say, are we leaning in? Are we stepping into the radicalness of the gospel, to the mission of Christ enough right now? Or are we just comfortable, um, and just going along, kind of rolling
Yeah.
along with the flow of things? Or are we really going out? And are we challenging ourselves to do that? Well, a lot of people are afraid to do that because they don't even know what they would do if if they did step out.
Yeah, what it takes and sometimes is a pastor who, has this vision too. And perhaps isn't so busy that he doesn't have the time to try and implement. The trouble with modern day priests, is Father so and so is is pastor of 18 parishes. Yeah,
Yeah,
he's like an
right.
old-fashioned circuit rider, going from church to church, and it just grinds them down and wears them down. Okay, all that being said, I think of the parish that I attend, St. Thomas More Parish in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It's an Anglican ordinariate parish. Our pastor, Father Eric Bergman, actually is a convert, and he's married. He has 10 kids, so that's kind of different. But my point is that I initially went to this parish because I was interested in the liturgy. But what kept me at the parish wasn't the liturgy's beautiful and I love it. Don't get me wrong. But it's an hour away from where we live. And I'm not certain I would have kept driving an hour every Sunday morning to this parish just for the liturgy. I don't think I would have, because the Novus Ordo liturgies around us are fine. But this was what kept me at this parish was the community and the pastor himself, because this parish has made a decision like what you were just talking about, right? Why can't parishes just go ahead and why does there have to be this liminal event that takes us to the boundaries and pushes us and provokes out of us community? Well, this parish made the decision we're going to do that. So, we have all these like we Dr. Philip Huckman, a medical doctor in the parish, is now offering damn near free medical care to anybody in the church and the surrounding. It's in a very poor neighborhood. There's a Providence Pregnancy Center, which is a crisis pregnancy center that our parish started with. Jennifer Frayne, laywoman, runs it. Very, very active. It has a thrift store attached to it. My wife and I are opening a Catholic worker food pantry associated. If we get the money, that's why we're kind of doing a fundraiser right now to do this food pantry associated with the Crisis Pregnancy Center. My friend Marcus Daly in the parish runs. He builds simple pine wooden caskets, Marian with a Divine Mercy theme, which he sells to bereaved people at very, very low prices, so they can bury their loved ones properly without spending $15,000, on overpriced caskets and so on. You get my point. There's
Yeah.
just so much going on in this parish. That's what kept me there. And it's made me into a better disciple. It's made me want to be a better, not just Larry Chapp, blogger, farmer, blowhard, bloviator. No, it's made me want to be a better Christian. Anyway, I'm kind of on a ramble right now, but you get what I'm. That's like a little fervorino for my parish. But why can't that be done other places?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it ultimately does come down to leadership, and that's maybe the third thing. The third thing I learned and unlearned and learned is that so much of what happens in a parish depends upon effective leaders, and you're not a leader if people aren't following you. We have a lot of managers in the church. A lot of people have positional authority, but not personal influence over their people. And I talk to clergy all the time in the Diocese of Pittsburgh about how important it is for the people to really hear from their spiritual father what really matters to them. And you have to make an appeal from your heart to theirs about getting engaged and getting involved. But what we typically get are, two or three announcements at the end of Mass, and then the rest of it's buried in the bulletin. Part of
Yeah,
the preaching office has to be a summons and a call to build up the life of the community and its reach of the parish and its reach out into the community. What you're talking about in terms of, the works of mercy, um, that and just the all the works of mercy, spiritual or corporal
yeah,
works of mercy.
yeah.
You're probably familiar with Rodney Stark's book about the rise of Christianity, which I quote
Great book.
pretty
Yeah.
extensively. Yeah, at the end of my book, I quote
God,
it.
that's an old book now. It's like 30 years old now,
Yeah,
35. Yeah.
yeah, but it's really good because it shows that the rise of Christianity and its spread was not magic. It was based upon a gritty commitment to living the Christian life, but it to live the way of Christian discipleship, which is framed for us in the Sermon on the Mount. And coming back to the point we made earlier about charity, it's how we embody incarnationally the person and the reality of Jesus Christ to everybody. It's not necessarily just about how we think or how we worship, as important and critical as those things are, but we really have to manifest the ethos of God's kingdom by how we embody it in our day-to-day life. But that's a formational reality. We have to be formed properly to be able to do it. You can't just tell people, go do it. I used to think you could do that. Just tell people, give them a workshop on this, and then they'll go do it. And what I find is they don't. They need to be
Yeah.
led through. And I do tease this out a little bit in the book, is that Jesus, he had his apostles follow him along the way, and he modeled for them what they did. He then sent them out to practice. He brought them back. He mentored and coached them up. Okay, go back out and try it
Yeah.
again. And over the course of 3 years, he planted the seeds for the first and largest movement in the history of the world. And I often will say Christianity is exactly that. It's the first movement. Christianity invented the idea of movement, and a movement is something where it's a sociological phenomena where a community grows not by procreation or by conquest, but by word of mouth, by sharing your fire, and your
Yeah.
enthusiasm for the gospel. And Jesus sent out 12 plus a handful of disciples into a very crazy world, and within 3 centuries had 20 million followers. Well, there's no better growth plan than that. I don't care what anybody says. So
Yeah.
that's why we need to relearn the method of the master, because there's no better way to grow the church than the way
Um,
he formed his
and,
disciples.
this is really an interesting question too. I mean, some would say, "Oh, the church became successful just because Constantine eventually, the Edict of Milan, and so on, and then Theodosius comes along after Constantine and makes Christianity the major legal religion of the empire." And yet, people tend to forget, why did Constantine, in a sense, first off, even know about Christianity? And let's be cynical here. Let's just say he was just using Christianity to help him unify the empire. I don't know if that's true or not, but let's say it is. All right. The question, well, that means that Christianity must have been wildly successful already.
Yes, he
Even in
was.
the right before Constantine was the reign of Diocletian that was persecuting Christians left and right.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think sometimes too we can flatten the narrative a little bit too much by saying, well, the blood of the martyrs is the seeds of the church. But in the grand scheme of
Yeah.
things, the number of Christians that died in those persecutions proportionally was not that big. What mattered,
Yeah.
and Stark brings this out in this book, it's like it's how the family lived its Christian life. It's how it took care of its neighbors. It was the conviction and deep belief that led all the way to the willingness to die if it came to that. Um, so that's the radicalness of the Christian way of life. There's a set of disciplines that are not so much a matter of us striving to be worthy of God's love in our life, but it's a kind of living that proceeds from a conviction of how much God loves us and how much mercy He's shown for us. And we just shouldn't, we can't help ourselves. That's the way the early church
Yeah.
was. They couldn't have thought of anything other than going out and sharing the good news with their neighbors. Well, the average Catholic sitting in the pew doesn't have that kind of conviction, at least here in the United States of America and across the West. You might find that kind of vibrant Christianity in Africa, and in other
Yeah.
parts of the world, but
Yeah, that means you have to be willing to create friendships. Nobody's talking here. I know you're not. I'm saying, lay people need to get up on a soapbox on a street corner
yeah,
and start screaming about, the end is near, can convert. That's not what we're talking. Or nobody's talking about, well, now you need to be a real chatty Cathy at work, where every single time you
yes,
get a chance, you're talking up Jesus to anybody. Oh, that's a surefire way to get everybody to hate your guts right there.
yeah,
No, what we're talking about, I'm struck by, yeah, in C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, and I love Lewis and I love Mere Christianity. He says, how do we get the divine life into us? He refers to it as a good infection.
yes,
We have to, and then he says we have to spread this good infection. There has to be something about Christianity that is fetching. We have to be infectious. There has to be something where people want to get close to us in order to catch the infection. And that means we have to be
yeah,
intriguing. It means we have to be a little provocative. We have to be a little different. Not in an obnoxious way, but perhaps in ways that are a little weird. Let's make Christianity strange again. Let's make Christianity weird again. Like I said, I often say there's bad weird and there's good weird.
yeah, right, yeah,
Bad weird is just weird, and it's repulsive. But there's good weird in the sense of, you know what? That dude over there has got something going on, and I'm interested in that. And boy, that's different. That's kind of strange, but man, and that's the way Christians. I think that's what we mean when we say we need to be a leaven in the world.
yeah. I mean, some of the things that I would point to specifically is, we first of all, we want to create networks of connection and fellowship with people. So friendship is the primary medium by which we
Yeah,
spread the gospel, because Christ Himself said, I call you friends, and the world will know that I was sent into the world by how you love one another. So how we care for each other, but most especially, a lot of times as Catholics we can focus on, well, how do I suffer? And of course we're called to suffer gracefully. We're called to, you know, be patient and practice forbearance in our life when we're going through hard stuff, and that's great and heroic. But the thing that really gets people's attention is how we insert ourselves into other people's suffering. It's where we show up and how we show up with a joyful countenance and a delightful
yeah.
disposition. Now, I can condemn myself because I can sometimes be gloomy and doomy and wring my hands with how the world is kind of going to hell in a handbasket. And the Lord
That's
always says to me,
guilty,
yeah,
guilty.
the Lord always says to me, you're not doing me any good. I had a very profound prayer experience many years ago where I heard the Lord in my prayer say to me, I really don't need anybody to defend me in my church. What I need is someone who can go out and proclaim my gospel with joy. And I remember I felt this question come over my heart, like, can you do that? And my answer to him was no. I really can't. I don't know how to do that. So that took me into a spiritual pilgrimage into the depths of my heart. And to answer that question, why can't I? Well, part of that problem is that you can keep all your attention on all the wrong things that are going on in the world and all the wrong things that are going on in the church, and I'm very guilty of this. But the Lord is saying, but pay attention to me and what I'm doing, because you can't help but to be joyful. You just can't see it because you don't have eyes to see and ears to hear. But I'm everywhere and I'm doing amazing things. So if Christians have that mindset and we go out with these networks of connection and friendship, and everybody's going to want to join. That's what's going to happen.
Yeah. Boy, I couldn't have put it better myself. And I do believe friendship is very important here. Um, and friendship with non-believers sometimes requires a great deal of patience. And I rush in to say the friendship has to be real friendship. In other words, you can't be consciously saying to yourself, I want to befriend this person so that eventually I can introduce my religion to them or,
Yes.
something about Jesus. It's got to be a genuine loving concern for that fellow human being, which only means you have to really desire to get to know them. I think back to my days as a professor at DeSales University, and I had many friends on the faculty, dear friends, with whom I'd have these intellectual conversations over lunch or whatever in, the dining hall. And it would always almost, and these were unbelievers. I'm thinking of there was a particular political science professor, psychology professor as well. And we would sit and have these long conversations about just about every topic except theology, except religion, even though they knew I was a theologian. And I developed a deep, not just intellectual friendship with them, but friendship in general, so that then they began, like you just said, sharing details of their life, their suffering and what's going on that makes them tick, and then you share your suffering with them, and then your friendship is on an even deeper level. And then finally, quite naturally into the conversation comes, hey chap, how the hell come you're a Catholic anyway? What's the deal with that? And then
Right.
boom,
Yeah.
boom. That took years,
Yeah.
years, and yet
Yeah.
there was the opening, there it was.
Right. And it's natural. It's spirit led. I mean, the thing is,
Yeah.
I often say in our ministry, we do not ever want to treat another person as though they are a project.
That's right.
It's we have to take a sincere and genuine interest in who this person is and what their life story is. And we have to, and this is the definition of charity, is that we have to love people for their own sake, not because we see them as a way of bending them back upon our own intentions
Yeah.
or agenda or whatever. And I think sometimes that's the difference between true evangelization versus kind of a proselytization, because when we evangelize, what we're doing is we're sharing the reason of our hope, which is a joyful enterprise where what we're sharing is the stories of how God has transformed our lives, how He has changed us and given us a new life, a new lease on life. And when people feel that, that's back to the contagion part about you. That's contagious. Like people will eventually, when they see that you're different because there's something that makes you tick or something that animates your spirit that they don't see in themselves or other people, they're going to say, "What in the world? Like what
Yeah.
water hydrant are you drinking out of, or what's in your morning breakfast,
Yeah.
but it's like, but it's, yeah, it's Jesus. That's what it is. It's the power of the Spirit working in my life. And and I think it raises a question in people's hearts, like, well, if God's doing all that in your life, then what would He do that for me? Would He do that in my life? And of course our answer to that is of course. And that's when the question comes, and the Spirit opens up that opportunity to really bear witness, if you will. That's what Jesus meant when He said, "You will be
Yeah.
my witnesses."
And not
So,
only that, what's interesting, and by the way, I'm often critical of certain aspects of the Pope Francis papacy, but I do believe that one of the things for which he is criticized by very conservative Catholics, and I think he's misunderstood, is precisely the distinction that he constantly makes between evangelizing and proselytizing. He's always coming down hard on proselytizing. Don't proselytize, don't proselytize. And I think he's right to do so because I think for the most part that's kind of a buzzkill. But I think he does that in the interest of a broader understanding of evangelization. But I would also like to add that in the evangelizing process for a layperson, who doesn't have a pulpit, who doesn't, at least I had a classroom lectern when I was a theology professor. But for the average layperson who doesn't have any of those things, friendship is the normal pathway. The thing that interests me too is that if the opportunity finally arises for you to be that contagion, for you to share the joy that is in you with somebody else, the thing that strikes me is how often we are changed as well by that process. That
Hmm.
we're not left untouched by that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, God is working in us through that other person as well,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
God created them too
Yes.
and gave
And
them
that's
gifts that
that's
we
what
need.
strikes you. That's what strikes you is like, I'm not superior to that person. I'm not better than that person. I just happen to have been given a great gift, the gift of faith, which for whatever reason has never fallen on this person. This person has never embraced it. But I must have humility. So many saints have spoken about humility being the gateway to true sanctity,
Yes.
you know.
Yes. Well, absolutely. I mean, we have to be small or little in our own estimation. And that's what gives us the right posture to not treat another person as a project, but to simply
Yeah.
be an instrument and a vessel of God's love in their life and allow God to work through us rather than thinking that we're going to somehow get out in front of God in bringing this person to Him. You know, um, it's God will use us, but only to the degree to which we're really humble and little in our own estimation.
Boy, that is so true. I want to return okay, I'll shift gears just a little bit here. We've been at this about 50 minutes, so we still have a little time. I want to return to your book and to the question of what has led the kind of a spiritual intellectual genealogy. What has led the modern world and the church into, for want of a better word, is this crisis of unbelief, this crisis of faith. Um, there is, of course, Charles Taylor and others who have put forward the famous secularization thesis, that, oh, the world has gotten more secular. With the rise of modern science, we've engaged in a demystification of the world, Max Weber. And so the demystification thesis, the secularization thesis, and I think there is some truth to that. But I've also, Michael, always believed there's also something missing in that narrative, it seems to me. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of the story. I think I mentioned earlier, what gave rise to modern Christianity has many tributaries that
Yeah.
played into it, all of which we could unravel. But, I do actually cite Taylor in my book because I think one of the most important things that he lays out is the modern Christian attempt to extract sin from the human heart through a kind of cold legislative discipline
Yeah.
that was adjudicated largely through the state. So the legalism and the kind of formalism of the modern age was probably the greatest betrayal of Christianity that history has ever seen because it's so antithetical to the gospel and even to Paul's theology.
Yeah.
Um, the law only has the ability to condemn. So what happened, I believe, is that we created a culture of shame and a shaming culture as a form of discipline that was somehow going to forge disciples in the crucible of social pressure and social discipline. And in my opinion, and I lay this out pretty extensively in the book, by the 1960s, that entire framework collapsed and imploded in the explosion of postmodernity onto the cultural scene through rock and roll, the hippie
Yeah.
movement, and all, emotivism and expressivism in art and the rise of pornography and all of that. It was basically a very critical part of the human experience, namely our emotional life, rebelling against the straitjacket of Kantian Cartesian formalism and what I think, I'm jumping here, but John Paul II's theology of the body is so critical because he provides an anthropological framework to reintegrate the life of the passions in a way that's whole, healthy, and human. And there's a lot of pastoral work that needs to be done to implement theology of the body on a parish level in terms of a formational experience. And it's not just about sex. It's about dealing with the
Yes.
human passions. And if you go back to Aquinas' treatise on the passions and the virtues was virtually ignored from 1500 all the way on until the latter part of the 20th century when
Ah,
the
man.
racehorse movement recovered it. We lost
Yes.
the 700 years of some of the best moral and the moral and just human psychology that had ever been presented to us.
Oh
So,
man. Yeah.
yeah, I could go on and on. There's so much to say about that, but
Oh my God. Yeah. Oh gosh, there is. There's like a billion things I might have to have you back on the show again because we got to talk about this. And the first off, theology of the body. Yes, 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 1,000 times yes. The problem though is I love what you said with regard to the fact it's not just about sex. Unfortunately, there were some, and I won't mention any names, who essentially reduced John Paul's theology of the body to a series of chastity talks for teenagers. Uh,
yes,
and it had its place. Nothing wrong with chastity talks for teenagers, but it really didn't do justice to the broad framework of the theology of the body, which was
yeah,
about far more about how to integrate the passions, virtues, and so on in the life of the mind and the life of the Christian, that our bodies have a sacramental language about them. And it's not just about the sexual parts of our bodies, but all the parts of our body. Yes. I think we've just begun to scratch the surface of the theology. I would recommend the works of Mikhail Waldstein
yes.
on the theology of the body. I can think of very few people that have done better work.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, and his introduction to the second edition of the English translation of the Theology of the Body is like one of the best tour de forces through modernity and all of the problems and the reductionisms. And then his follow-up book on the glory of the Logos. I mean, it's I took a year to read that book. I studied under him at the ITI, and so
oh,
some
I didn't
yeah,
know that. That's
so
great.
so much of what I've learned within a properly what I would call a holistic Thomism, because a lot of the
Yeah,
traditionalists I think have retreated into a kind of neo-scholastic Thomism, and the anthropology is not there, especially in the moral life. But Waldstein is second to none in his exposition of the history of what went wrong. So if you really want a very thorough answer of how modernity lost the narrative thread of
yeah.
the Christian story, Waldstein's the glory of the Logos in the flesh. Wow. I mean, it's hard. You got to be a pretty educated person to read it. I have to be
Oh,
honest,
yeah.
but
He's not for the faint of
yeah,
heart. This is
yeah,
not for,
yeah,
just an armchair, you know, theologian type to say, "Oh, I'm just going to pick up Bulge." No, it's for a more theologically educated audience.
yeah.
Nevertheless, if you are theologically educated, it's a book. Waldstein's works are worth having. I also want to seize upon something else you said, Michael, which is that. Uh, there was so much, and this is once again part of the certain mythologies that we have to deconstruct. There was so much in the thought of Thomas Aquinas that had been ignored for centuries in the church. There's a reason why Leo the 13th, at the end of the 19th century, had to, in a sense, re-emphasize, you know what, folks, we need to be studying Thomas Aquinas more. People tend to think, oh, yeah, the church was just all about Aquinas for centuries and centuries. And not true. Not true. I mean, there were little summaries of Aquinas, commentaries on Aquinas, little snippets of Aquinas people might read. But one of the things, you're absolutely right, Michael, one of the things that got truly ignored in the writings of Aquinas was his profound anthropology, his profound, and as that works itself out in his profound understanding of virtues and vices and the moral and spiritual life, it seems to me.
Yes, well, the whole what I call the interior landscape of the soul. It
Yeah,
really is a psychology of the human person. And so much of what modern psychology is now rediscovering, I would say, honestly, and then putting empirical data under are things that Aquinas already understood, albeit in his own framework, his own philosophical framework. But there's so much
Yeah.
overlap with a lot of the things that are, and
Yeah.
and we see some beautiful healing ministry emerging in the church today too, which I think is rooted in a proper Thomistic anthropology, which opens up the interior life in a way that allows grace to go to work on the particular parts that exist within ourselves. Our mind, our hearts, our
Yeah.
memory, um, our emotional life, the passions, and all of
And there
that.
were
And
some scholastics. There were some scholastics that were paying attention to, in a sense, Aquinas's broad understanding of the soul. For as many disagreements as I might have on the level of the theology of nature and grace with Garrigou Lagrange, Lagrange was very good at unpacking Aquinas on these. Charles Journet, same thing.
yes,
Uh,
Charles de Konig.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. And there were others. So I don't want to leave the impression that the scholastics were all just, it was all just benighted ignorance. No, not at all. There was some good stuff going on even in the neo-scholastic world. But I think generally speaking, yeah, this aspect, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, this aspect of Aquinas's thought, gets completely ignored.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you're describing, those characters in the story are the ones, the leaders who transitioned us out of the Neo-Scholastic age. And as a kind of ressourcement, you know, uh,
Yeah,
renewal from the sources. Let's go back to the sources of Christian life. But again, I want to circle back briefly on that point I made at the beginning, which is it's a great vision, but you have to have a pastoral plan for the implementation of that vision. And I think we're still working on it as a church. I mean, it's there. You go back to the early to mid 20th century and the theological work that was being done by that generation. It's just unparalleled. I mean, you can find other historical moments like the 13th century when Bonaventure and Aquinas and so on were studying together themselves. But
yeah,
there's not that was an extraordinary age, and we still have a lot of implementation work to do. Because what does that theological vision look like practically on the ground for the average parishioner in the average parish across the postmodern landscape today? Like,
yeah, yeah.
wow. I mean, there are so many layers to that.
Yeah, boy, there sure are. And I couldn't agree more that we still just don't seem to have a coordinated pastoral plan. In some ways, it goes back, like you said at the very beginning, you don't want to reduce these things to the whole liberal conservative divide, the traditional Catholics versus more progressive Catholics. And yet, there's an element of that in play here in the sense that I think it's one of the reasons why we don't have a more coordinated pastoral strategy across the board from the top down, trickling everywhere, is because we simply have very basic, fundamental theological disagreements on the level of anthropology, ecclesiology, even Christology,
Mhm.
uh, that are still unresolved.
Yeah, and in this country and across Europe, I think we are very much conditioned by the political landscape. And so
Yeah,
if you're operating in a little bit more of a liberationist and morally progressive, context, then you're going to fixate on a certain set of issues. And if you're in the
yeah,
more sort of traditionalist or neo-scholastic, kind of mindset, you're going to be fixated on a certain set of issues. And the other sort of group I touch on in the books are what I call the people in the psycho-spiritual paradigm. Those are the kind of kumbaya Catholics. And then there's the charismatics, the charismatic evangelical types. So there's these different subcultures within the church that have their own theological cues, their own brand identities, their own virtue signals. The irony
yeah,
of it is it's so postmodern. They're very postmodern in their way of expressing, in some cases, like with the
yeah.
traditionalists, they're very modern, quote unquote, sensibilities. And so, and I don't think anyone's to blame. I think we all grew up in different contexts and received the formation that we got. I think what we have to do is lay aside our prejudices and our biases, and we have to return to the feet of the master. And we have to once again let the Lord teach us what it means to be his followers and to be in fellowship with each other, and to respect, first of all, to call ourselves to a unity that we all are obliged to cultivate and build up. But also we have to recognize our differences in our different charisms, in our different, we put the accents in different places, and the Catholic Church is big enough to accommodate that. So it's a
Boys.
beautiful part of our faith.
Wow. We should probably maybe end with that because that is a great summation, I think, of everything. Um, so do you have any last thoughts, last words before we sign off here today?
Well, that's a dangerous question. So I'm going to say no, because then I'll go on for another 10 or 15
Uh,
minutes. But I would
uh,
love to, this
Well,
has
go
been
ahead. If
such
you have
a,
more to say, if you say it.
no,
I
no,
don't want to necessarily cut this off I just like to keep these things to around an hour and 10 minutes or so,
yeah.
these podcasts. But if you have more you want to say, I don't want to cut you off either.
I don't actually. I think this has been a really good conversation. I mean,
I do
obviously,
too.
read the book, because I really drill
Well,
into a
this
lot of these
brings me
issues.
to my
Yeah.
my final point and an apology, which is like I said, I normally have a chance to at least peruse extensively the books of my guests. I did not get a chance to do that with you. So I have absolutely loved this conversation, Michael. And I'm definitely going to get your book and I'm going to read it. And I would love then to have you back on so that I'm not hamstrung as an interviewer by, in a sense, just sort of reacting to what you're saying, that I actually then maybe have some more substantive questions of my own that I would bring. So I apologize in some sense that I wasn't as prepared for this interview as I normally am. But in some ways too, it allowed me to be a bit more reactive instead of imposing myself on the conversation as I tend to do. Uh, but if you're
Yeah.
open to it, I'd love to have you back on.
Oh, no, I would love it. This has been a great conversation, and very
I,
enriching for
I
me
I
personally.
agree, and
So
I will put
let's
in the
do it
notes
again.
at the bottom of the YouTube video where people can get a hold of your book. And
Yeah,
I
and
hope,
also if you would just for people watching, listening, my organization is preambula.org, uh, and maybe put that in the show
and
notes
maybe you
too.
could send me a link via email so I could
Yeah,
so
I'll
I
do
could.
that. I'll do that, because that you can learn a lot more, about what I'm doing practically on the ground, which is kind of trying to embody what we've talked about today, and
Yeah.
people can explore the
Well, and
website
people
and
are
check out
always
what we're
interested
doing.
in that. Okay,
Yeah,
what's the
yeah,
concrete? What's he actually really doing? So
yeah.
that absolutely send me that link, and we'll link that and how to get your book. Well,
Okay,
thanks so
very
much for
good.
coming on the show. We'll definitely
Yeah,
have you back on in the near future, as soon as I bring myself up to speed and get your book, and I encourage other people to do the same. Thank you, Mike, and thanks to everyone for watching now.
yeah.
Bye.
Thank you, Larry. Great to get to know you. God
Great
bless
to
you.
know you too. Bye bye.